I've always liked being alone in the woods. There's something about the quiet that settles me. The steady rhythm of my boots hitting the dirt, the cool bite of the air in the morning. Out there, it feels like the world finally slows down enough to breathe. No phones buzzing, no cars honking, no endless chatter. Just trees, sky, and the sound of my own breath. I never thought the woods could turn on me, but they did. It started on a Friday morning in early October. I took the day off work to hike a trail I'd been eyeing for a while. A loop cutting through the northern part of the state, not far from the mountains. It wasn't a well-known spot. I found it mentioned on a hiking forum where people post about remote trails, the kind that don't show up on park maps. That's what I was looking for. Quiet. The plan was simple. Hike about 15 miles the first day, camp overnight, and finish the loop the next day. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food, the basics. The weather was supposed to be clear, but I threw in a rain jacket just in case. I always carry a paper map and compass, even though I keep my phone for backup. I know better than to trust electronics out there. I hit the trailhead just after 7 a.m. The morning air was cold enough to sting my nose, but I warmed up fast once I got moving. The first few miles were perfect. Wide trail, soft dirt, golden sunlight cutting through the trees. I passed a couple of hikers heading back toward the lot, but after that, it was just me. Exactly what I wanted. By noon, I'd covered about 8 miles. I stopped at a small creek to refill my water and eat. As I sat on a rock by the water, I checked my map. The trail looped around a ridge before dropping into a valley where I planned to camp. I'd be there before sunset. No rush. The trouble started around mid-afternoon. I'd been walking for another couple of hours when the trail began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually. The dirt path got narrower, the trees thicker. I had to duck under branches and step over fallen logs. I figured it was just an overgrown section. It happens. But then I noticed something odd. The trail markers, little blazes of paint on the trees, were getting harder to find. I stopped and scanned the trees around me. Nothing. No blazes, no cairns, not even boot prints in the dirt. I pulled out my map and checked again. According to the terrain, I should have been on track, but nothing lined up. The ridge I was supposed to see was nowhere in sight. I took out my compass to double-check my direction. The needle wobbled, then spun lazily before settling. That was the first time I felt a flicker of panic. My compass never acted like that. I shook it, tapped it, stayed still this time, but something felt off. I decided to keep moving. I'd walked far enough. I had to hit something soon. A creek, a ridge, a familiar marker. Anything. But the longer I walked, the worse it got. The trees started to look the same. Tall pines with thick, rough bark and dark branches. The ground was soft with moss, fallen leaves crunching under my boots. It wasn't just that the trail had disappeared. It was that nothing stood out anymore. No landmarks, no changes in the terrain, just the same trees over and over. I checked my phone. No service. Not surprising. I tried backtracking, but after half an hour of walking, I ended up in the same spot. I'm sure of it. I saw the same cluster of 3 trees. One of them split down the middle by a lightning strike, the wood pale and raw. I don't believe in superstition, but something about it made my stomach drop. I sat down on a rock and forced myself to think. I wasn't going to panic. I had food, water, and supplies. I wasn't hurt. I just needed to focus. I decided to follow a downhill path. Water always runs downhill, and if I could find a creek, I could follow it out. I walked for hours. My legs ached, and the light was starting to fade. I checked my watch. 6:18 p.m. sunset was coming fast. The woods were already getting dark. I pulled out my headlamp but didn't turn it on yet. I didn't want to admit I might be spending the night out there. Finally, I found water, a shallow stream barely moving. I knelt down to fill my bottle, but the water was cloudy. Not muddy, just off. I drank anyway. I needed it. By the time I set up camp, it was nearly dark. I pitched my tent in a flat spot near the stream and crawled inside. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I was frustrated, angry at myself for getting turned around. But the night felt wrong. Too quiet. I'm used to hearing insects, owls, the rustle of branches in the wind. But there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing, loud inside the tent. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up, not because of noise, but because of the lack of it. My body wouldn't relax. When dawn finally came, I packed up fast. I wanted to keep moving. I still had food, water, and time. I could find my way back. I had to, but nothing changed. I walked for hours, following the stream, but it just twisted through the woods without leading anywhere. I checked my compass again. It spun. I tried my phone. Dead. I don't even remember the battery draining. That's when the fear really set in. The logical part of my brain told me there had to be an explanation. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd gotten turned around worse than I thought. But deep down, something felt wrong. I've been hiking my whole life. I know what it feels like to be lost. This was different. By the second night, I was exhausted. I barely had the strength to set up my tent. I ate the last of my food, drank what water I had left. I was running out. That night, I woke up to something new. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not heavy. Not close. Just far enough to keep me guessing. I didn't move. I lay there, holding my breath, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, but it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like someone walking, taking their time. In the morning, there were no tracks. I packed up and started walking again, but my legs were weak. My head was pounding. Dehydration. I had to find water. When I finally stumbled out onto a road, a narrow, cracked strip of asphalt, I almost cried. I followed it until I found a car, flagged it down. I didn't even ask where I was. I just wanted to get out. I've been hiking a lot since then. I tell myself it was just a fluke, a bad trip, bad luck. But I've never gone back to that trail. I don't even look at the map anymore, because sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear those footsteps. And I don't know if they were ever really behind me, or if they're still waiting out there. I've always liked hiking alone. People think it's risky, heading out into the woods with no one to talk to, no one to watch your back. But I've never seen it that way. I like the quiet. I like the rhythm of my feet on the dirt, the way my breath evens out after a mile or two. Out there, things make sense. You put one foot in front of the other. You keep moving forward. That's all there is to it. At least that's what I thought. It was late September, and I had the weekend off. I planned a 2-day hike through a stretch of forest about 3 hours from home. Not an official trail, one of those routes you find on an old hiking forum where someone posts a blurry screenshot of a map with a circle drawn around it. Great views, very remote, the post said. Perfect. I wanted remote. I didn't want to see anyone. I packed the way I always do: water, food, a tent, sleeping bag, and the basics: map, compass, headlamp, first aid kit. It wasn't supposed to rain, but I threw in a waterproof jacket anyway. Better to have it and not need it. I left early, hitting the trailhead just after sunrise. The first few miles were easy. Wide trails, tall trees, the kind of scenery that looks like a postcard. I barely looked at my map. I knew I was on track. By late morning, I'd reached the fork where the main trail curved toward the ridge. I went the other way onto the narrow, unmarked path I'd seen on the forum. Right away, it felt different. The trees were thicker, the trail rougher. I liked it. It felt like I was walking into another world. A few hours in, the forest got quiet. Not all at once, it was gradual. The birds stopped singing. The wind that had been rustling the leaves faded to nothing. I noticed it but didn't think much of it. It happens. Animals move on. I kept walking. The ground got rougher, more uneven. Tree roots twisted up through the dirt, rocks half buried in the path. I had to slow down to keep from tripping. The trees started to close in, the kind where the branches hang low, blocking the sun. It felt later than it was. I checked my watch. 2:15 p.m., plenty of time to make camp before dark. I pulled out my map to check my location, but the landmarks didn't line up. I was supposed to hit a small creek by now, but I hadn't seen water for miles. I figured I just missed it. Maybe it dried up. I kept moving. Another hour passed, then 2. The light was fading fast. I still hadn't seen the creek. I started to feel it then, that gnawing sensation in my chest. The kind you get when you know something's not right, but you don't want to admit it. I tried to shake it off. I wasn't lost. I just got turned around. It happens. I found a flat spot to set up camp. A small clearing surrounded by trees. I pitched my tent, ate a quick dinner, and sat outside for a while, listening. Still no sounds, just that heavy, pressing silence. I told myself it was fine. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to sleep. I woke up in the dark. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay still, listening. My heart was pounding, but I didn't know why. I checked my watch. 3:12 a.m. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Not close, but not far either. I held my breath, my hands gripping my sleeping bag. It wasn't an animal. I know what animals sound like. These were deliberate, steady. I wanted to believe it was another hiker, but I knew it wasn't. Nobody hikes out here at night. I stayed still until the footsteps faded. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe it was a deer. I lay awake until the sun came up. By morning, I was packed and moving. I wanted to get back on track, find the creek, find the trail, to figure it out. I had to, but the further I walked, the more I realized I wasn't going the right way. I kept checking my map, but nothing matched. I should have hit the ridge by now. I should have seen something familiar. I tried using my compass to correct my course, but the needle kept spinning. I tapped it, shook it, still spinning, put it away. The trees all looked the same twisted branches, the same patches of moss. I walked for hours, but it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. My water was running low. My legs ached. The sun was dipping lower again. That's when I saw the campsite. Not mine, someone else's. At least it used to be. The tent was collapsed, half buried under leaves. There were clothes scattered around, torn and dirty. A rusted stove sat near a cold fire pit. I crouched down, checking the gear. It looked old, not years old, but not recent either. A couple of weeks, maybe? Couldn't tell. I found a backpack near the tent and opened it. Food wrappers, a water bottle, a notebook. I flipped it open. The first few pages were normal notes about the trail, the weather. Then the handwriting got messy. Can't find the trail. Compass isn't working. Something's following me. My chest tightened. I closed the notebook and dropped it. I didn't want to read more. I grabbed my pack and kept moving. Faster this time. I wasn't thinking about where I was going. I just wanted to get out. But the woods kept going. The trees never changed. The ground never changed. I checked my map again, but I might as well have been holding a blank piece of paper. I threw it in my pack and kept walking. By the time the sun started to set again, I was exhausted. I found another clearing and collapsed against a tree. I needed to rest. I needed to think. My water was almost gone. I hadn't eaten all day. That's when I saw it. Boot prints. My boot prints, leading in a circle around the clearing. I stared at them, my breath catching in my chest. I hadn't walked in a circle. I'd been moving in a straight line for hours. I felt the panic rising, the kind that makes your hands shake and your head go light. I ran. I don't know how far. I just ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed in the dirt, gasping for air. When I looked up, the trees were thinning. I saw power lines cutting through the sky. A road. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely holding me up. When I reached the edge of the trees, I turned back. The woods looked calm, quiet. I never figured out where I went wrong. I never found that spot on the map, and I'm not going back to look for it. I never thought much about hiking alone. I always figured if you stayed on the trail, packed enough water, and let someone know where you were going, you'd be fine. I wasn't trying to be brave or prove anything. I just liked the quiet. Being out there with nothing but the sound of my boots, hitting the dirt, and the wind moving through the trees cleared my head in a way nothing else could. So, when I set out that morning, I wasn't expecting anything more than a long walk and a good view at the top. I got a lot more than that. The trail was familiar, one I'd done a few times before. It wasn't too crowded, which is why I liked it. Early spring meant the trees were still bare, but there was enough green creeping back in to make it feel alive. The air was cool, the kind that feels good when you're moving, and the sky was one of those perfect, cloudless blues. I had my pack with the usual stuff: water, snacks, a basic first aid kit, and a light jacket just in case. The first few miles were easy. The ground was damp from the rain 2 days before, but not muddy. I kept a steady pace, my breathing even, the rhythm of my steps keeping me focused. The higher I climbed, the better the view got. Hills rolling out in every direction, dotted with patches of forest and open fields. I stopped at one of the overlooks, took a few pictures, drank some water, and kept going. It wasn't until I reached the less traveled part of the trail that things started to feel off. It's hard to explain because nothing was really wrong at first. There were no weird sounds or bad weather rolling in. If anything, it was too quiet. The birds had stopped, and I noticed the wind wasn't moving the trees like it had been earlier. I shrugged it off. Sometimes the woods get quiet. It happens. The trail narrowed as it wound through thicker trees, and the ground got rockier. I slowed down, watching my footing. That's when I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A pile of bones, small ones. Maybe a rabbit or a fox. They looked fresh, picked clean, but still a little red. I'm not a hunter or anything, but I've been outdoors enough to know that wasn't normal. Usually, animals scatter bones, carry them off. This pile was neat, like someone or something had put them there on purpose. I stood there for a minute, just staring. My brain tried to reason it away. Maybe it was some kind of predator. Maybe a hawk dropped it. I moved on. About half a mile later, I found another pile. This time, bigger bones, a deer maybe. Same thing. Clean, stacked almost like a pyramid. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My stomach tightened. I wasn't scared yet, but I was on edge. This wasn't normal. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, but as soon as I lifted it, I realized I had no signal. That wasn't unusual this far out, but it didn't help the way I was feeling. I kept walking, slower now. My eyes were scanning the woods on either side of the trail, but everything looked the same: trees, rocks, dead leaves. No movement. I thought about turning back, but I was closer to the top than the start. If I got to the summit, maybe I'd get a signal. Another mile in, I found something that stopped me cold. A boot, just one, lying on the side of the trail. Worn, covered in mud, but not old. It looked like it had been there maybe a day or two. I picked it up, turned it over in my hand. It was heavy, like the person wearing it had just stepped out of it. I looked around, calling out, "Hey, anyone out here?" Nothing. No answer. No movement. Just trees. I set the boot down where I found it and kept moving. My heart was pounding now. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't calm either. I was alert, every sense sharp. Then I found the campsite. It wasn't on the trail, just off to the side where the trees opened up a bit. There was a tent, one of those lightweight backpacking ones, partially collapsed. The fire pit was cold, but the ashes didn't look old. A pack leaned against a tree, still zipped up. I called out again. "Hello?" Nothing. I walked closer, my footsteps crunching softly on the dead leaves. The tent flap was open just enough for me to peek inside. It was empty. The sleeping bag was unrolled, and there were clothes scattered around. It looked like someone left in a hurry. I checked the pack. I know I shouldn't have. It felt wrong going through someone else's stuff, but I needed to know what was going on. The food was still there. Water too. No wallet, no phone. Just gear. I left it how I found it and backed away. By now, I wasn't thinking about the view at the top. I just wanted to get out of there. I turned back the way I came, walking faster than I had on the way up. My heart was pounding harder with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder even though I didn't hear anything. And then I did. Footsteps. Not loud but steady. Crunching leaves, breaking sticks. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. My mouth went dry. I turned around, scanning the trees. Nothing. I waited, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I kept walking, faster. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. I wanted to run, but I kept telling myself that if I ran, whoever or whatever was out there would follow. The footsteps started again, closer this time. I whipped around. Who's there? My voice cracked. Silence. I backed away, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept moving, walking as fast as I could without running. I checked my phone again. No signal. My palms were sweaty, my breath coming fast. It wasn't until I hit the main trail again that the sound stopped. The birds were singing. The wind was blowing through the trees. Everything was normal, but I didn't stop. I kept walking until I saw the parking lot through the trees. I practically jogged the last 100 yards. When I got to my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a minute, breathing hard. I pulled out my phone. Full signal. I never found out what happened up there. I checked the news for days. No missing person reports. No stories about strange findings. I thought about going back, but I never did. Some people say the woods are peaceful, but now I know better. Some places aren't peaceful. Some places just don't want you there. I wasn't looking for an adventure. I just needed space. Too many hours at work. Too many nights staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was holding my breath for no reason. The mountains were my reset button. Just me, my pack, and a trail that stretched far enough to forget about everything waiting for me back home. I picked a route I hadn't done before. About 20 miles, mostly through the backcountry. Not an official trail, but a few posts online said it was doable if you knew how to navigate. I liked that it wasn't popular. I wasn't looking for company. I packed light but smart. Food for 2 days, water, a filter, a lightweight tent, and the basics: map, compass, first aid kit. I threw in a jacket just in case the weather turned. It was supposed to be warm, but mountains don't care about forecasts. I set out early, just as the sun was coming up. The first few miles were easy. The trail was wide, well-marked, the kind where you could walk without thinking. I settled into a rhythm, letting my breathing and the crunch of my boots on dirt drown out the noise in my head. After a couple of hours, I reached the point where the trail forked. The main path went left, where the tourists and weekend hikers stayed. I went right, where the trees grew thicker and the trail markers faded. First, it was perfect. The forest felt untouched, the kind of quiet that makes you feel small in a good way. I passed through stands of pine, the ground soft with fallen needles. The sunlight filtered through the branches in shifting patterns. I stopped to fill my bottle at a creek and sat for a while, listening to the water rush over the rocks. It wasn't until midday that I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker in a long time. I pulled out my map, traced my finger along the route I thought I was following. It was hard to tell. The landmarks didn't line up with what I was seeing. I checked my compass, picked a direction that seemed right, and kept walking. Another hour passed. I wasn't panicking, but I was annoyed. I've been hiking for years. I know how easy it is to miss a marker or get turned around, but something about this felt different. It wasn't just that I was lost. It was the way the forest felt. Off. It was too quiet. I know that sounds cliche, but it's true. The birds were gone. The rustling in the underbrush, squirrels, rabbits, nothing. Just the sound of my boots on the ground. I stopped and stood still for a minute, listening. All I could hear was my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe there was a predator nearby, a bear or a mountain lion. It happens. I kept moving, but the feeling didn't go away. The ground started to change. The soft dirt gave way to rocky terrain, the kind that's hard on your ankles. The trees grew closer together, their branches twisting overhead, blocking out more of the sunlight. I checked my watch. It was later than I thought. The shadows were getting long. I needed to find a place to camp. I figured I'd gone far enough off course that backtracking now would just get me more lost. Better to set up for the night, rest, and try to find my way in the morning. I scanned the area and found a flat spot near a cluster of boulders. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. I pitched my tent, ate a quick dinner, and sat outside for a while as the sun went down. I kept expecting the forest to come back to life, the way it usually does at dusk when the insects start buzzing and the night animals wake up. But it stayed quiet, unnaturally quiet. I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. I'm not sure how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling of nylon, but at some point, I drifted off. I woke up to the sound of something moving, not far off, close. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't an animal. I know what animals sound like, the shuffle of paws, the snap of a twig. This was different, heavy, 2 feet. I reached for my knife, my fingers shaking. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows across the ground, but I didn't see anyone. The footsteps had stopped. I waited for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only a few minutes. Nothing moved, no sound, just that same oppressive silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I heard my own footsteps echoing in my head from earlier. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, clutching the knife. I didn't sleep. By dawn, I was packed up and ready to go. I wanted to get out of there, back to a real trail, back to the comfort of knowing where I was. I started hiking fast, barely stopping to check my map. I figured if I kept moving in one direction long enough, I'd hit a road or a trail. I had plenty of food and water. I just needed to keep moving. After a couple of hours, I found another campsite, or what was left of it. The fire pit was cold, but the ashes looked recent. There was gear scattered around, a torn-up tent, some clothes. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. That feeling in my gut got worse. I checked the ground and found boot prints, deep like someone had been running. They led away from the campsite, toward the trees. I thought about following them, but something told me not to. I kept walking. The forest started to thin out a bit, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I was getting close to a trail. I pushed harder, ignoring the ache in my legs. That's when I saw it. Another set of boot prints. Not old, fresh. They were mine. I stared at them for a long time, my breath catching in my chest. I had been walking in circles. I'm good at navigation. I know how to use a map and compass. I shouldn't have gotten this turned around. I sat down, trying to calm myself. I wasn't hurt. I had food and water. I could figure this out. I just needed to focus. As I sat there, I realized something. I wasn't hearing birds. I wasn't hearing wind, but I could hear breathing. Not mine. Slow, steady breathing. I didn't look back. I got up, grabbed my pack, and started walking. I walked for hours, fast. I didn't stop, didn't check my map, didn't drink water. I just kept moving until I saw power lines cutting through the trees. I followed them until I hit a road. A passing car slowed down and I waved them off. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to get home. I never figured out what happened in those woods. Maybe I got lost. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I still hear those footsteps. And I know I didn't imagine them. I checked the weather before I left. Sunny with a light breeze. Perfect. I packed light but smart. A couple of water bottles, some trail mix, a jacket in case it cooled down, and my trusty multi-tool. I'd done plenty of hikes before, but this one was different. I was going solo, deep into the mountains where the trails were less maintained. It wasn't about the thrill. It was about getting away. Work had been a grind, and I needed to clear my head. A few days out in the woods sounded like the perfect reset. The first few miles were easy, wide trails, clear markers. Birds chirped from the trees above, and the sun filtered through the branches, casting moving shadows on the dirt path. I barely broke a sweat. After about an hour, I reached the fork where the main trail continued to the left, but I veered right onto an old fire road that wasn't on the official map. I'd heard about it from a guy at the gear shop. He said it was overgrown and steep but led to some of the best views in the range. Sounded good enough to me. As I went deeper, the trail got narrower. Grass and ferns brushed against my legs, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and damp. I kept moving, keeping a steady pace. I wasn't in a hurry. I was just walking, thinking. letting the miles put some distance between me and everything I wanted to forget for a while. About 2 hours in, I reached a small ridge. I stopped to catch my breath and take a drink. From up there, I could see miles of untouched forest. No houses, no roads, just green trees stretching out in every direction. The silence was heavy. Not the kind you notice in the city, where there's always some hum in the background. Out here, it felt like the world had turned itself down to a whisper. I sat for a while, letting the breeze cool the sweat on my back. The sun hung high in the sky, bright and warm. After a while, I checked the time and decided to keep going. I wanted to make it to the next ridge before I stopped for lunch. The trail kept getting rougher. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree, the bark rough against my palms. Further down, the path was blocked by thick brush, so I had to push through it, thorns snagging at my jacket. I didn't mind. It felt good to work for it, to be out here with nothing but the woods and my own 2 feet. About 3 hours in, I noticed the quiet. Really noticed it. The birds had stopped chirping. No rustling in the underbrush, just my footsteps crunching on the dirt. It wasn't spooky exactly, just odd. I paused, listening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I told myself it was nothing. The woods get quiet sometimes. Maybe a predator nearby. I kept moving. The trail was barely a trail by that point, more of a suggestion. I kept having to check my map, but it was old, and the markings didn't match up with what I was seeing. I figured I'd gone off track a bit. No big deal. I could always backtrack if I needed to. Then I saw the boot print. One single print, half sunk in the mud. Fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. It wasn't mine. I knelt down, feeling the dirt, still damp. Someone had passed through here recently. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. No other prints, just that one. I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd missed the others. Maybe it was old and just looked fresh because of the shade. I kept walking. About 20 minutes later, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker or any sign of the ridge I was aiming for. The trees felt closer, the path harder to follow. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but there was no service. I wasn't surprised. I knew that could happen out here. I had an offline map downloaded, but the blue dot kept jumping around. It wasn't helping. I checked my watch. It was getting late. Not sunset late, but late enough that I needed to make a decision. I could push forward or turn back. I hated the idea of turning back. I wasn't lost, not really. I just needed to find my bearings. I decided to push on for another 15 minutes. Worst case, I'd backtrack before it got dark. That's when I found the campsite, if you could even call it that. A fire ring made of rocks, long since cold. Some trash scattered around. An empty can of beans, a torn-up sleeping bag. It didn't look recent. Maybe a few weeks, maybe longer. I walked closer, kneeling down to check the fire ring. Someone had been here, but they left in a hurry. There were broken branches, footprints going in different directions, and something about it just felt wrong. Then I noticed the smell. Faint but sharp, metallic, like rust. I followed it a few feet to the edge of the campsite, where the grass was flattened. In the dirt, there was a dark stain. Dried now, but I knew what it was. Blood. Not a little. A lot. My chest tightened. I told myself it could have been anything. An animal, maybe a deer. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I decided to head back the way I came. I'd been walking for maybe 5 minutes when I noticed the second boot print. Same size as the first. Same shape. But this one was facing the opposite direction. Toward where I'd just come from. I started moving faster. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't running, not yet, but I was close. The woods felt different now, darker, even though the sun hadn't set. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. The trail I'd come up on didn't look the same going back. I kept finding places where it split in two, where I swore there hadn't been a fork before. I'd choose a direction, walk for 10 minutes, then realize I wasn't seeing any familiar landmarks. The more I tried to correct my course, the more lost I got. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I was panicking. My breathing was too fast, my hands shaking. I told myself to calm down, to focus. I sat down, drank some water, and forced myself to think. I had two choices: keep wandering or hunker down and wait for morning. I still had food and water. I wasn't hurt. I wasn't about to die out here. But something in my gut told me not to stay. Not in these woods. I got up, grabbed my pack, and started walking. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it was somewhere else. The dark came faster than I expected. My headlamp cut through it, but the shadows seemed deeper. Every sound made me flinch: the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I walked for hours, or maybe it just felt that way. And then, finally, I saw it. A light, distant but steady. I stumbled toward it, breaking through the trees into a dirt road. A park ranger's truck was parked there, headlights on. I nearly collapsed when I reached it. The ranger looked at me, startled. "You all right?" I nodded, breathless. "Yeah, just got lost." He offered me a ride back to the trailhead. As I climbed into the truck, I glanced back at the woods. They looked calm, peaceful. But I knew better. Something was out there, and I wasn't going back to find out what. I don't know why I picked this trail. Maybe it was the pictures, endless green trees lining the hills, the kind of place where the air looks fresh even in photos. Or maybe it was the name. Black Ridge Trail had a ring to it, something rugged and remote. I wanted to get away from everything for a few days, clear my head. Work had been a mess. My apartment felt like a box, and I needed something real, something that hurt a little. I figured a solo hike would do the trick. The first few hours felt like I was in the right place. It was just me, the trees, and the steady crunch of my boots on the dirt. The trail wasn't crowded, which was what I'd hoped for. I passed a few people near the trailhead, but by the time I reached the deeper woods, I was on my own. The kind of alone where you can hear your own breathing. It was calm. I felt calm. I had packed light, just enough for an overnight trip. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, the basics. The sky was clear when I set out, and the forecast said no rain, so I wasn't worried. I planned to hike about 12 miles, camp overnight, then head back the next day. I wasn't trying to break any records, just unplug for a bit. But the thing about the woods is you never really know what's going to happen once you get deep enough. I found that out the hard way. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something weird. I had been walking for hours, but I wasn't tired. I wasn't even sweating much, which was odd because the sun was out, and it was warm. I stopped to check my water, sat down on a rock, and realized I hadn't drunk nearly as much as I thought. I took a long sip, felt the water sit heavy in my stomach. It was then I realized something else. It was quiet, too quiet. When you're deep in the woods, there's always noise. Birds, insects, the wind in the trees, something. But here, nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the distant creak of branches swaying above. I told myself it was nothing. Sometimes the woods get quiet. Maybe I was overthinking it. I pushed on. About an hour later, I noticed the trail was getting harder to follow. It wasn't marked well to begin with, just faded blazes on the trees every so often. But now it felt like they were getting farther apart. I kept moving, figuring I'd spot the next marker eventually. But I didn't. After a while, I stopped, scanned the trees. Nothing, just forest in every direction. I pulled out my map, but it wasn't much help. I knew where I was supposed to be, but when you're standing in the middle of the woods, every direction looks the same. My phone had no signal, not a shock, but it still made my stomach drop. I decided to backtrack. That's what they tell you to do, right? Go back to where you last saw the trail markers. So I did, or at least I tried. I walked for maybe 20 minutes before I realized I didn't recognize anything. I kept expecting to stumble back onto the trail, but it never happened. I looked for anything familiar. A fallen log, a bend in the trees, but it all blurred together. I checked my compass, but it didn't make me feel any better. I was heading west, but west to where? I kept walking, thinking I'd cross the trail again eventually. I didn't. The sun was getting lower. The light through the trees was turning that dull, gold color you only see in the late afternoon. I stopped again to take stock. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. But my heart was starting to beat a little faster. I drank some water, forced myself to breathe slow. I had gear. I had food. I could camp for the night, try again in the morning. No big deal. People get lost all the time. But then I noticed something else. My footsteps. I had been walking on soft dirt and leaves all day, but now the ground felt different, firmer. I looked down and realized I was standing on rocks. Smooth rocks, like river rocks. But there was no river. I followed the rocks, figuring maybe they'd lead me somewhere. Dry creek beds usually end up somewhere, right? A river, a road, something. But the farther I walked, the more I noticed how dry it was. The rocks were bone white, dry as dust. I bent down, picked one up, crumbled in my hand. The woods were getting darker, shadows stretching long between the trees. I thought about setting up camp, but something in me said to keep moving. I still wasn't panicking, not really, but there was a tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. The kind you get when you know something's wrong, even if you can't say why. I kept following the rocks until I found something I didn't expect. A shoe, just one, lying there on its side. It looked old, faded, dirty, but not like it had been there for years. I stared at it for a long time, longer than I should have. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, but it wasn't. Shoes don't just end up in the middle of nowhere for no reason. Someone lost it, or left it. I walked on. Then I found another one. Not a match, a different shoe. A kid's sneaker this time. Smaller, just lying there in the dry creek bed. My heart was pounding now. I wanted to turn around, go back the way I came, but I didn't know which way that was anymore. I kept moving faster now. I found a jacket next, then a backpack. Empty, just lying there, half buried in the rocks. I checked inside, hoping for something. A phone, a note, but there was nothing, just dirt and leaves. By the time I realized the sun was gone, it was too late to set up camp properly. I pulled out my headlamp, scanned the trees, but the light felt thin, like it wasn't reaching far enough. I set up my tent fast, hands shaking a little more than I wanted to admit. I crawled inside, zipped it up tight, and sat there in the dark, listening. Nothing. No wind, no insects, just silence. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shoe, the backpack, the dry creek bed. Something wasn't right. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but it didn't feel like that. Felt real. I don't know when I finally passed out, but when I woke up, it was still dark, and something was outside my tent.